We're back on the road to Reykjavik and the semi-final candidates match between Bobby Fischer and Bent Larsen, played in Denver in 1971. Now, if you remember, in those first two games, Fischer won the first game brilliantly, extraordinary fight. Larsen tried to hit back straight away in the second and threw all his pawns up the board, and Fischer defended brilliantly and Larsen finally cracked. So 2-0 after two games. If you haven't seen those games, then do check out the playlist. You'll find it up there in the info tab, and also the whole Fischer playlist. You'll find them in the video description if you haven't seen all those games already, and many others besides. And if you're not a subscriber, then do click on that subscribe button down there. Okay, so we're into game 3 of this semi-final match. And it was quite clear that Larsen wanted to hit back with a win. You know, he wasn't trying to steady the ship with a draw because he's playing a Sicilian. He's switched from the French and he's taking Fischer on in, well, a battleground that, of course, Fischer knows incredibly well from both sides. Fischer, a great exponent of the Najdorf, and on the white side, you know, always, well, not always, but very often played open Sicilians. So we've got this classical variation, and Fischer had a great love for the Sozin, Bishop c4. I'm kind of surprised he didn't play Bishop g5 actually, because I think that would have suited his strategic style very well. But, well, Bishop c4, very straightforward, and he had enormous experience and great success with this move. So the bishop just nudges back to b3 before anything funny happens with d5. And now, previously Fischer had played castles against Geller, but, well, Geller took on d4. Fischer won a nice game, but actually that should have been okay for black. So bishop e3, so that makes sure that the knight can be recaptured by the bishop, but also white can play queen e2 here. Now, Fischer had played queen e2 here against Larsen in the interzonal tournament in Palma de Mallorca, and Fischer had actually been defeated there. Larsen won a really nice game. So instead of playing queen e2 and casting queenside, Fischer played f4. And he'd played in this way before. Now, a very common line is to take here and then play b5. Fischer had a lot of experience with that move, but Larsen played bishop d7. And here Larsen went a6, which is okay. We'll see later on in the match he played queen c8 in this position, but here he played a6. And Fischer carried on very directly with this strategic move f5. So you can see that white is putting pressure on this e6 pawn. And one of the ideas is that, well, you want to force this pawn forward, and that will open up this diagonal for the bishop and weaken the d5 square. So, well, this has been played before, and then e5 to take the pressure off e6, and then the bishop drops back. And perhaps to exchange off the knight on f6, and white gets control over d5. In fact, this is still playable for black, actually. Black can survive by using, well, tactical tricks based on knight e4. This is playable, actually. Another way of playing this position is to take on f5 and then play bishop c6. And that bishop is a rock here on c6 and can give black counterplay. But obviously, you know, in this case, white's bishops also look very good as well. So Larsen tried to sort of hold things together here with queen c8, and he'd used this idea previously in games when he played against the Sozin. So you can see that the queen and bishop protect the e6 square. So he's trying to keep this bishop out of the game. But this is a big mistake. I think he must have mixed up his lines. Fischer took on e6, and if pawn takes, then white has knight f5, and that is really unpleasant. Looking at those 2 points, obviously using this pin here, the knight can't be taken. So Larsen took on e6 with the bishop. Now already I'm looking at this and thinking, that looks rather dubious, giving up the bishops. I mean, by this stage, it's just not very good for black at all. And now Fischer just played knight a4. I think in playing queen c8, Larsen just mixed up his lines. It's just a big mistake. Threat to play knight b6, attacking queen and rook, forking queen and rook. But the queen also has to keep an eye on the e6 pawn, and black simply can't manage everything here. So Larsen just played rook b8, and after the knight came in to attack the queen, that queen had to just move away, and Fischer won a pawn. Extraordinary. A complete disaster for Larsen. In a way, I think the opening isn't the most interesting part of this game, actually. You think, well, Fischer has basically a winning position here. So is it so interesting what happens next? Well, yes, I think it is, because what we see now is Fischer's superb technique. He keeps everything so simple. That's what's wonderful about this. And there's still a bit of work to do, but, well, anyway, let's continue and you'll see what I mean. Well, first of all, he's got to keep an eye on that pawn, so bishop f5. And he's hoping that Larsen will play g6, which just opens up his king a little bit, and will block the queen as well. But Larsen puts the knight on e5. Now, it's this e5 square that gives black a little bit of hope in this position, because that knight can't be driven away by a pawn and controls a lot of squares. So this makes life just a little bit awkward for white. Queen d4 from Fischer. Strong centralization, connecting the rooks. Got to be good. And the queen pops out to h5. Little bit of activity. You never know when a knight g4 might come. How do you deal with this? Well, Fischer's answer is very clear. He just exchanges off one of those dangerous knights. So he's just simplifying, basically, but keeping control. I think control is the key word here in this game. Queen comes to e2. Well, Fischer will have calculated this. It's a little bit of activity for the queen, but actually it's all under control. And Fischer does it with tempo. Bishop a7. Of course, that bishop is not going to remain on a7. It's going to come back into play at some point, but what Fischer is doing is just gaining a tempo. So the rook comes across and rook f2. So now the queen is under fire and has to move back. So in this case, Larsen puts it back on b5. Now you could exchange here and double the pawns, but actually that might give black a bit of counterplay on the a file, and also that knight may be coming into c4. So Fischer just played c3, and that means that the b2 pawn is protected by the rook, so everything still protected, everything under control. Bishop h4. from Larsen attacking the rook. That's prevented. And Larsen decides finally, okay, I've got to trade queens. And the bishop comes back. So after that trade of queens, Fischer still has his extra pawn. The bishop now has this e6 square with that pawn anchoring it there. And this is just beautiful for white now. And bishop e6 just stops any counterplay at all. And that bishop, well, it's turning into an archbishop. We had some discussion on the channel about how you should term beautiful bishops like this that dominate the opposing rooks. Lots of suggestions. I like archbishop, from a bishop into an archbishop. That's very simple, very strong. Some people like starfish, after the octopus knight. Yeah, also good. I'm going to stick with the archbishop. Now, what happens if black tries to shut this bishop out of the game? Well, in fact, white is fine after rook f4. Now, if that knight takes the pawn here, then here, that knight can flap around a bit, but white has two ideas. One, maybe rook c6, and sometimes you can attack this pawn on a6. Well, we have two beautiful bishops here, actually. This is just tremendous for white. And coming back here, yeah, rook f4. If rook a8, we can take, and then the rook comes in here. And once again, that bishop just does a superb job of dominating the enemy rooks, and white's rook is about to take a second pawn. So that's the position we have. Bishop is on e6, just moved to e6. Rook a8, driving the bishop away. And this is great. The bishop just comes back into the middle. Fischer doesn't mind about the double pawns. That's not checkmate, of course, because there is a pin. So white recaptures. Now, Fischer was famous for trading positional advantages. And this is a really good case where he did have the two bishops, but he's exchanged one of them off, and that pawn fulfills a really important function of controlling that e5 square. So it means that this knight is now on a really bad circuit. It basically can't get to a decent square, and the rook and bishop dominate totally here because this rook is also out of play. So very nice transition from Fischer. And let's just see how this works in practice. Well, there's no hurry at all. Now that knight has to go back. So if the knight checks, then just king e2, and everything is under control. So the knight came here, king e2 anyway. And now the rook comes in and comes over to d8, threatening the pawn. I mean, black has absolutely nothing here. And Fischer doesn't mind giving that pawn because it means his king activates. This knight is still totally dominated. If the knight comes back here, then we can simply start pushing that pawn down the board. Larsen exchanges into a rook and pawn endgame. Fischer is still one pawn up, and he dominates the position. And now I imagine the game was adjourned here, but Larsen resigned. Good technique. The rook cuts off the king, and then that means that basically we're playing with king and pawn against rook, and the king will just shepherd that pawn down the board to the queening square, completely winning for white. Fantastic technique from Fischer. Someone once said that the secret for winning a war is not to fight any battles at all. And that's my impression when looking at this game with Fischer's technique. Basically, he just controlled the situation beautifully, and Larsen just was never in the game at all. But shocking mistake from Larsen in the opening. He just got his variations mixed up with Queen C8, but great technique from Fischer. Remember, if you want to support the channel, help us keep the lights on, then do check out the links to patreon.com and PayPal. They're in the video description down there. And as I said, if you're not a subscriber, then do click on that subscribe button below as well. Thanks for watching.